Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. Today what we're going to talk about is the recent PIPEDREAM or INCONTROLLER event, which was an alert that came out about a new toolkit that was discovered before it was used that could impact control systems. So we'll start out talking about what INCONTROLLER or PIPEDREAM was, and then we'll hop into how you can use open source tools to threat hunt for it. Specifically, we're going to look at the network side. So we're going to talk about using Wireshark to look for the techniques that we're seeing in the reports that came out about this event. So hopping right into it. So back on April 13th, CISA released A22103A. And at the same day, Mandiant and Dragos and Schneider Electric released complementary reports. From what can best be told, there were at least 3 different groups between CISA and then Schneider and Mandiant working together on it, and then Dragos also working on it, and they all basically released the report on the same day. But in this report, basically what it outlined from the CISA report, this quotes here, is they saw APT or nation state actors exhibiting capability to attack control systems. We'll talk about different components of this malware in the next slide, but then we'll jump in. But an important thing to note is there was no signs of use of this tool in the wild. This was allegedly caught before it was used anywhere. So that's kind of an interesting development, if you will, for that. So jumping right into it. So what INCONTROLLER or PIPEDREAM was is it had basically a series of different modules that were included with it. And depending on if you read the Mandiant or Dragos report, there's of course different naming between the two. But it contained really 5 basic functions. So there was an OPC-UA module, which OPC-UA is a pretty common industrial protocol that's used in a lot of environments that could read-write tags, brute force credentials. And then there was also modules for CODESYS, which is a proprietary protocol we'll talk about a lot, and OMRON, FINS protocol. That's also another proprietary one. Luckily, that one's actually already in Wireshark, we'll see. Beyond that, there was another CV they used for ASRock drivers to load vulnerable drivers to get around some of the signing. And then there was another backdoor that was used both for Recon and C2. What we're going to focus on today specifically are those middle 2 lines. So both the CODESYS and then the FINS approach. And because those are the ones that we can see with Wireshark. So let's hop right into it. So hopping on right into it with FINS. So FINS is a protocol that a lot of PLCs out there actually support. It uses both TCP and UDP over port 9600. The Wireshark dissector that exists, what's nice with this protocol is it already has the commands and it has the dissection for things like run and stop commands like memory writes, file transfers, logs, writes, and clears, and some of the other features. So, I don't know the accuracy of the dissector, but looking at the dissector and the reference and what it looks like in when you load a packet capture file in, it looks to be somewhat complete. A lot of features in their dissector. I'll also say, so there is a sample PCAP if you do go to the Wireshark website to the wiki for OMRON FINS, the link's there at the bottom. What's nice with that PCAP is that PCAP actually has packets for a lot of the function codes. So if you're interested in a function code, chances are it's in that packet. And what's nice with it too is early on in that PCAP, you have the requests, and then at the bottom of the PCAP, for some reason, are all of the responses. So you can see both sides of that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take a line from the CISA report, and we're going to talk about what that might look like when you look at it in Wireshark. Again, when Mandiant, Dragos, CISA, when those reports came out, there wasn't a whole lot of bit and byte actionable level detail. A lot of it was just kind of high level on the malware. And so what we're hoping to do today is show maybe a few things if you're actually having to look at this traffic, what you can look for. Other quick note, we don't actually have the samples. So a lot of this, again, is based from taking these lines out and then looking at what the protocol traffic looks at it on the wire. So starting with the CISA alert line of backing up, restoring arbitrary files to the PLC. One of the ways you might do this is OMRON command 2203 in hex. That's a single file write. When you do a single file write over OMRON, You give it the file name and you actually have the file data, right? So this is what an example of a single file write, what might be used. Again, because the reports are generic, we don't know what was actually used. This is just one way it might be used. But there's multiple file write functions and memory write functions in there. So the last example was a file write to disk example. Well, with OMRON, you can, and with the FINS protocol, you can actually also write file data to memory. So in the same deal, you have your file data and you have your block number that you're actually writing to. So again, taking this line, if you're trying to get it actionable and if you're trying to look for, hey, what behavior would I look at if I'm looking at FINS in Wireshark? You do need to make sure that you cover the function codes here, both in memory and in disk. Hopping on, another one also is files can be copied. And so if an attacker is able to get a file up another way, or if they need to move a file around, when you talk about backing up and restoring files, you might, an attacker might use a file copy or file movement there. The file copy command, again, it's just hex 2207. It's all in that omron.command field. And so when you're setting up analytics or you're setting up extraction out of PCAP, that's a great field to have. The other thing to note is both, so you see both filename.source and filename.nest. One of the pains, depending on how you're actually doing this out, is you'll notice your source and dest file name are the same field in Wireshark. But again, this is, you get all of this data into fields. So when you're talking about threat hunting or detecting on this, if you're using Wireshark, you actually get a lot right out of the box. And finally, last one, if they're covering their tracks, they can also remotely delete files. So hex command 2205 for this, they can give it actually the number of files. So the example here, we actually see them deleting 2 files at once. So they can delete 1 or more files. But if you're looking for an attacker moving files around, backing up files, if they're doing deletes over the FINS protocol, you're going to see it on the wire. So this is another good thing potentially to look at. So wrapping up this specific bullet, so if you have FINS in your environment, beyond just looking for the metadata of FINS traffic going on, some of the questions you should ask are, what are those function codes you're looking at, right? And if you're looking right for those writes, for file writes, are you looking both the ones that are going on the device, on the disk of the device, and also in memory? Because if you're only doing your analytic on half of it, obviously you might miss something out, right? It's not going to be potentially a complete analytic there. Another big one, right? Are you parsing file metadata, right? So, you could do a whole nother layer to this analysis by actually looking at what is the actual data that's coming across, and is it the data that I expect when I expect it going on? If you're using passive network monitoring, these are questions you should ask your passive network monitoring vendor. Hey, what are you actually pulling out from FINS? Hey, are these FINS function codes, or are these different kind of, are these different events accounted for in your analytics there, right? Whether it be file write to memory, file write to disk, you want to make sure that that flow chart of attacks is complete and that the analytical fire when you think it'll fire, and that it's not kind of a one-path analytic case there. And that gets to alerting thresholds, right? If the analytic that's written for FINS is only written for a very specific approach for this, your alerting threshold might miss that, right? So you need to make sure your alerting thresholds, both on that function code and potentially on that data lower down. If you don't have FINS, the good news is this can be applied to other OT protocols. So with FINS, it's a pretty full feature protocol, right? You have file reads and writes, you have a lot of, you have run and start and stop commands. You'll see this with a lot of other similar protocols. So, and that's to say too, the good thing here is Wireshark can help you with that threat hunting level. And it's nice here because FINS file transfer, so getting to that says a bullet, is done in the open. So monitoring it actually is pretty easy. So hopping to another part, so jumping into the Mandiant report, right? So in the Mandiant report, and this was unique to the Mandiant report, which was kind of interesting, they said, hey, one of the features of the toolkit was wiping of program memory and device resets. So thinking through kind of how that works on a lot of devices, generally before you'll write program memory, you'll put the device into stop mode. And so one of the function codes you might see here is OMRON command hex 0402. This is the stop command. So again, if you think through the behaviors of, okay, if Mandiant said this tool can wipe program memory and do device resets, you might want to look for that stop command followed then by the actual memory right there. And we'll actually get into the memory right now, right? So wiping the memory. The other thing important to say is specifically Mandiant said program memory. So there are other points of memory. We're not going to cover those as much today. You should cover them if you're worried about other parts of memory on your device. But specifically changing program memory, the other important thing to consider is that these are protected areas. And so you might see the attacker, you might see the malicious traffic actually call the program area protection clear. So this is clearing the protection off of the device. This is hex code 0305 when it's coming across the wire. The cool other thing you see on there in the OMRON program number is you can see the program number that the remote request was made to, and you can see the password, right? And password's really interesting, right? Because you can look for that brute forcing now. You can look for use of a default password. If you wanted that to be an alert and be like, hey, you know, how many of the devices in this plan are using the default OMRON password to, you know, clear the protection on program memory, you could do it straight out of this one packet. So very, very, you know, important packet to consider when you're looking at, you know, wiping up program memory and device resets feature in here. When it actually comes to, so if they want to clear it by writing over it, you know, you might have that OMRON command 0102 in hex. And again, you'll get a block number. And then in Wireshark, the actual data that gets written is in that omron.command data. So here you can see from the image that a bunch of A's are being written to block 1. This might be one area, one way that memory is cleared. You might see also other writes though too, or some of the other clears. So specific to this one, if you're looking for wiping of program memory and device resets, the good news is this also can be done passively. But the big things to consider to make sure you can do it are you actually watching that program memory protection change, right? Are you seeing that password go across? Are you seeing that function code? Are you looking for the default passwords, right? Are those passwords coming from machines you expect them to come through? Also in that series, right? Are you seeing that stop command before program memory is written to? Some devices are going to require that stop command before. And then are you actually looking for that wipe or that reset of program memory, whether that be through a write or through another function code there? Again, this can be applied to other OT protocols. Depending on the protocol and device, the sequence of commands and what you see is going to be slightly different, but the approach can very much be the same. And Wireshark, again, can help us with this. So last one I think we're going to look at is loading a custom malicious agent on there for additional attacker-directed capability. Through some of the reports, there was discussion of Telnet. This is all theoretical. The CISA, Dragos, and Mandiant reports contain absolutely no detail on how this was done. And so for this section, we're going to kind of have a brainstorming idea of a few different ways you might see this. But one way you might see this, right, is a memory area file transfer, right? So if you upload your malicious agent and then you move it into a part of memory to run it, you might see OMRON command 220A, and this is actually a memory area file transfer. And so in this, you can take you give it the space in memory you want that file to be written into, and then you give the file to write in there, right? So looking for this tactic, depending on the PLC and how it actually manages, how it actually manages memory space, this might be something you see. Again, all theoretical. Again, program area right too. So if this malicious agent runs in program, in the program area, you're going to see a program area right? So hex 0307. Again, you'll see where it writes to. Where it writes to is very relevant because depending on the PLC, they map memory differently. And so again, they might write into a part of memory that you really don't expect. So, this is another good way of doing of them potentially doing remote memory writes into program space. And you see the command data here. So seeing A, B, C, D written into program space, which is in the case of this packet, what happened, that might be something, again, that you say, okay, I might not know if I just see this packet, if it's a malicious custom agent getting loaded, but depending on how the attacker is doing it and if it's a vulnerability, where the vulnerability is, this one way you might see it. So memory area transfer, right? If you're moving it from one area of memory to another, again, maybe this is to actually get it to execute. You might see command 0105, right? So this starts it from OMRON memory address, 0105 and moves it to CCCD. So again, depending on how the actual execution of this or how the loading works, if you're doing it memory to memory, this is a function code you might see in there. So again, details are very light. All of this is theoretical. We're just kind of throwing things out of the box. I don't know what actually works with these devices. It's an interesting science experiment to see, or if the malware actually comes out, if we see samples, we can see potentially what to look for in this. But a few things to consider as you're looking for this are, where are those specific writes, either in memory, in regular space, file space, in program memory space, and can I get a baseline of what those normal writes looks like? So if an attacker is having to do this to load that custom agent, I know, hey, that's kind of out of place. And then obviously where you really want to go eventually, if you have the capacity to do it, is actually looking at the payload, right, and saying what actually is being written over when it's being written over. Again, this works with a lot of protocols. Immediate to mind, DNP3 would be an interesting one to look at this with similar capabilities, right, on a lot of devices. A bonus analytic, this was not seen in the PIPEDREAM or INCONTROLLER attack, but while we're here, let's talk about it. OMRON command hex 2103, this is an error log clear. So if an attacker is covering their tracks, you might see this in conjunction. It's honestly this easy and this small of a packet to kind of clear that rolling buffer of error codes off the device. A lot of times don't think of like this as a error log being like a Windows event log size error log. A lot of times this is just a buffer of error codes or device diagnostic information that helps. But if an attacker is doing any of these techniques, and they want to get rid of the signs that they did it, because some of the signs might actually create error log messages, definitely look for this. But again, bonus analytic, this was not seen or not reported on in any way that I know of in this event. So wrapping up OMRON fins, and then we'll jump to CODESYS. So the protocol does have a Wireshark dissector. That's the good news for us. And that Wireshark dissector, like we saw, it has file, it has memory, it has disk. There's a lot of features. There's a start, stop. So there's a lot we can do to look at fins as we're going through. These behaviors are super nice for us, both for monitoring baselines for regular detection purposes, and also for threat hunts, right? So, hopefully you saw as we talked through this, there's a lot of opportunities to build threat hunting hypotheses, to throw data across these as we understand how the devices actually work. And finally, make sure that your detections in your environment include the appropriate part of fins, right? So those function codes, and they go deeper, right? So if you're starting to want to do things with files or with the passwords, or password brute forcing is a good example there, right? Make sure that what you're actually doing to detect in the environment lines up with what you're looking for. And again, last note on this, this obviously works across a bunch of protocols. So hopping out of fins, fins was our easier. We started with fins because it was lower hanging fruit. There's a Wireshark dissector. Let's talk about CODESYS and how we can do a similar approach for what's in the report. So unfortunate for CODESYS is it's a proprietary security by obscurity protocol. Luckily for us, Kaspersky ICS did a blog series into the CODESYS protocol. They did a lot of dissection. It's pretty clear they created a Wireshark dissector. They even had source code associated with them taking apart the CODESYS protocol. The now partially redacted is, unfortunately, I think they were asked by the CODESYS group to take it down. And so some of the research now is down and it's not available on Wayback Machine. Already looked there too. And so when you look at that, right, it truly, to us as defenders, what stinks, and hopping on the soapbox a minute there on it, what stinks about CODESYS is, there's we know less about this protocol again because Kaspersky was asked to take this down. So with this, we're going to only be commenting on Kaspersky's analysis. We haven't validated if it's true or false in any tests. It seems pretty thorough and it seems true. But just quick disclaimer there, we're only going to be commenting on Kaspersky's effort. We actually did not do any reverse engineering. But we're going to link it to the INCONTROLLER and PIPEDREAM report, similar to what we did with the other one. The Kaspersky ICS Cert series, it's a 3-part blog. The first one, or the link for the first blog's below. We'll talk about the second one too. So CODESYS itself supported both in TCP and UDP. And it's actually a protocol, if you look at that diagram on the left, it's the same package that just goes over the different layers, right? So, true to the OSI model, for those super familiar with the OSI model, they just, tack on as it goes down the layer, they just tack on the additional headers there. There are defined programming ports, and quite a few of them here, 1740 through 1743, 1217, 11740, and also some other controller-specific ports. If you want to dive deeper into CODESYS, the codesys.com page actually has a really cool blog called Your First CODESYS Program. They go really deep, and you'll actually begin to see some of the ports and other features that CODESYS has in the protocol itself. So Kaspersky's research, though, produced a CODESYS dissector. This wasn't open sourced, but as you see through the blog, and what's interesting as you look through their blog with this is you see the screenshot of the dissector they produced. In this case, if you have CODESYS in your environment and you want it, you're unfortunately going to have to write your own dissector. This is an exercise left for the reader. Again, with the source code being asked to, being pulled down, will a dissector ever be open sourced? It's hard to know because obviously there is that legal question of if you release a dissector, are you going to be responsible for if you get that takedown request? So building the dissector might actually be an exercise for the reader. But that being said, hopping back into this, Kaspersky's research in their blog, in part 2 of their blog, the link's there below, they really go into both how on the TCP and UDP side, how this packet is handled when it's dropped down. So you have your PDU level, and then below that you have your datagram level. So we'll see different layers. We're talking down the layers now. And when you get to your datagram level, this is where the concept of services start to come in. And again, how CODESYS is routing it over UDP and TCP is looking for, at this layer, a service ID and a message ID field. So again, when we talk about monitoring or when we talk about looking at INCONTROLLER or PIPEDREAM type techniques on our network, we want to start at the service ID and message ID field here. On Kaspersky's blog and out there, there's actually different values of what some of these service IDs and message IDs relate to. But if you're not tracking it at this level, you're not going to be able to find the functionality that was talked about in Controller or PIPEDREAM. So according to Kaspersky, so there's that, and you can see the diagram down here. You have your block driver layer, you have your datagram layer. Once you get down into the channel layer, this is where we actually start to get into these similar file and device functions that we saw with the other options. This is another important layer for metadata monitoring. As you can see from the blog screenshot on the left there, you do start to get those service groups that are pulled out of the packet. So again, if they're going to the log service, right, that's going to be hex 05. If they're going to some of the shell, that's going to be 11, right? So again, in understanding, if you're wanting to understand CODESYS, because it is a layered protocol, this is a really important layer to track that service group as you go down it. The service layer is where we get those features that were used by INCONTROLLER and PIPEDREAM. And at this layer, even one layer down, when you go into services, there's what's called tags. And this is where a lot of the very specific functions are called from. So if you're familiar with like enip and SIP, this is kind of very similar to that SIP, to a SIP model that they've done with the protocol. It is a complicated protocol in that way. But what we can see here is once we're down at the tag layer, we can see this is an authentication request, and you see administrator in there. Once you understand down to the tag layer, this really starts to make sense. So, and you can see on this screen here, you have like that red layer, which is the datagram fields. You have the yellow, which are your orange, which is your channel layers. And you can see each of those layers when you actually look at it dissected out in Kaspersky's screenshots. If you implement your dissector, if you look at the bytes on the wire, this is kind of the approach that you'll need to take for CODESYS to get down there. But once you get down there, right, we see the authentication request, and specifically in this case by administrator. So in this case, CODESYS is a good example. Like I said, it's more complicated, it's proprietary. If you have this protocol in your environment, you need to consider what metadata you're monitoring and at what packet layers. Again, this is where it's really important to understand whether you're doing it yourself or you're using a vendor. How deep does your dissection and analysis go? And are you covering all those CODESYS ports, right? So if it's one of the proprietary or weird device ports that a device uses, you want to make sure it's covered. So wrapping up, we took very kind of generic information and we were able to take it down to the specific protocol, whether it be CODESYS or OMRON fins. And from there, we were able to get to some actionable hunts or ways that we could use Wireshark to actually go through the packet and figure out either what we want to monitor or hunt for. So this is a way, again, taking generic information, making it actionable from the reports. So thanks for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the talk. I know it was a little longer, and we hope to see you back next week. So thanks a lot for tuning in.